Welcome to Hero Paws 77, where true stories of loyalty, loss, and quiet redemption come alive. In today's deeply moving video, you'll meet Duke, a 19-year-old German shepherd left to fade away in silence until a grieving woman with a shattered heart chose to sit beside him and simply say, "You're not alone." This isn't just a story about a dog. It's about what it means to be seen, to be remembered, and to be loved again when the world has already turned its back. Stay with us until the very end, because this story holds a lesson many overlook, and a conclusion you won't want to miss. If you believe in second chances, in quiet courage, and the power of connection, subscribe to Hero Paws 77. Let's reach 10,000 hearts together, one story at a time. Certainly. Below is the English translation of Part 1. No one waits for a soul that's gone dim, rewritten in natural American English, preserving all the depth, tone, and emotional nuance of the original. Duke had once been proud. For 19 long years, the old German shepherd had served with unwavering loyalty. He had watched over his family, protected their home, and stood guard through countless seasons. He had run fast, barked fiercely, and stood tall. But age catches everyone eventually, even the silent heroes who walk on four legs. Duke had grown old. His strong frame had withered. His once golden coat had turned patchy and dull. His legs trembled when he tried to stand, and his eyes, once sharp and alert, were now clouded and tired. And when weakness finally caught up with him, the family he had protected, the ones he had loved without question, dropped him off at a shelter. Quietly, without tears, without goodbye, they left him behind like an old chair no one had room for. Duke didn't understand. But he knew one thing: they weren't coming back. And so he stopped waiting. At Montana Haven Animal Shelter, a cold, quiet place tucked behind leafless trees and snow-dusted fields, Duke had waited 6 long months. He wasn't alone. The shelter was full of dogs. Puppies barked for attention. Young ones wagged their tails at every passing visitor. They begged for love, for a chance. But Duke didn't beg. He didn't move. He didn't even look up anymore. He lay curled in the back of his kennel, a motionless shadow of the dog he used to be. Visitors passed by without so much as a glance. Nobody wanted a dog that old. Nobody wanted cloudy eyes and fragile bones. "He doesn't even drink much these days," whispered Emma, one of the younger volunteers, as she knelt to refill Duke's water bowl. Greg, the shelter manager, stood nearby, arms folded across his chest. He gave up eating the day he realized they weren't coming back for him. Greg sighed, glancing toward the kennel. "He's just waiting now. I don't know if it's for a new home or to give up entirely." Duke's ears twitched at the sound of their voices, but he didn't lift his head. He had stopped caring. Until the day she walked in. Sarah Bennett hadn't stepped foot in the shelter in over a year. The last time she had, it was with her husband, Jake. They used to volunteer together, walking the abandoned dogs on weekends, handing out biscuits and belly rubs like hope. But Jake had gotten sick, and in the blink of an eye, he was gone. After that, Sarah had shut the door on a lot of things, the shelter being one of them. But that morning, something pulled her back. Maybe it was the echo in her kitchen, or the ache in her chest that never quite let up. Maybe it was the wind blowing through a window she hadn't opened in months. Or maybe it was something else. Something like fate. She walked the rows slowly, her boots echoing on the concrete floor. Dogs jumped and barked for attention, eager tails thumping against metal bars. Each one full of life, full of wanting. But then, in the very last corner of the shelter, she stopped. There, in the farthest kennel, lay a dog who didn't move, who didn't bark, who didn't even look at her. And for some reason Sarah couldn't explain, her breath caught. There was something about the stillness in that cage that felt eerily familiar, something that felt like her. "Who is that?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Emma and Greg exchanged glances. "That's Duke," Greg said softly. "He's been here 6 months. He's really old, Sarah." She stepped closer, kneeling down by the cage. "How'd he end up here?" Greg exhaled through his nose. His family brought him in, said he was too old, that they didn't have time for him anymore. His voice hardened. 19 years, Sarah. 19 years he was theirs. And they just left him. The number hit her like a stone. 19 years. That was a lifetime. How do you walk away from something you've loved for that long? She stared at Duke through the bars. His ribs rose and fell slowly. His ears were tattered from time. His body looked exhausted, not just physically, but deeper. His soul looked tired. She had seen that look before. She had worn it. Without another word, Sarah unlatched the kennel door and stepped inside. "Duke," she whispered. No reaction. She reached out, not touching him yet, just hovering her hand inches above his coarse, matted fur. "Duke, look at me." There was a slight stir. Then, for the first time, the old shepherd opened his eyes, cloudy, broken, and searching. His gaze met hers for just a second, just long enough for her to see it. Pain, confusion, loss. And then he looked away. Most sheltered dogs react when you enter their space. They bark, they wag, they cower. Duke did nothing. He had given up. "Don't get your hopes up," Greg murmured behind her. "He's not like the others." She turned slightly. "What do you mean?" Greg sighed. "We've had older dogs before. Some come in scared. Some aggressive. Some just depressed. But Duke..." He hesitated. "Duke's empty." Sarah looked back at the broken dog in front of her. 19 years. A life spent giving. And this was the ending he'd been handed? She took a deep breath. "He wasn't always like this," she murmured. Emma perked up. "What do you mean?" Sarah reached out again, just barely brushing the air above his fur. "I don't know much about German shepherds," she said quietly, "but I know dogs. And no dog makes it to 19 without someone loving him. No dog survives that long without choosing to live." Emma bit her lip. "So what happened to him?" Greg folded his arms, jaw tightening. "All we know is what the owners told us. That he was just a pet. That he slowed down. That they didn't have time for an old dog." He looked at Sarah. "They made him sound like an inconvenience. Not like someone who had spent his entire life protecting them." Sarah swallowed hard. "They had him since he was a puppy," Greg added quietly. And that was it. That was the moment something inside her shifted. 19 years. And they left him. The ache in her chest, the one that had never truly gone away, bloomed with something deeper now. Something like fury. Something like sorrow. But most of all, understanding. She looked at Duke again. "I'll take him," she said. Emma's head shot up. "Wait, really?" Greg blinked. "Sarah, are you sure? I'll take him," she said again, this time firmer. Greg hesitated. He might not make it through the night. Sarah's voice was steady. "Then at least he won't spend his last night alone." And just like that, the door to a new story creaked open, quietly, without ceremony, because no one should be forgotten. Not at the end. Not ever. Sarah never thought she'd bring another life into her home after Jake died. The house where they had once lived together still looked the same. The living room remained tidy. Their wedding photo hung perfectly level above the fireplace. The second coffee mug still sat untouched in the cupboard, exactly where Jake had left it. It wasn't that she couldn't move on. It was that everything had paused. The laughter, the footsteps, the warmth, gone. Now, in the backseat of her car lay a body that barely moved. Duke hadn't stirred since they left the shelter. He hadn't made a sound, hadn't shifted position. Swaddled in an old blanket she grabbed on the way out, he was curled up tight, smaller than she remembered, almost like he had folded himself in, trying to disappear. Sarah had thought she was used to silence, but the kind of silence coming from behind her, it made the air feel colder than any Montana winter. The wind howled as she pulled into the driveway. Pine needles scattered across the porch, the remnants of last night's storm still clinging to the eaves. She shut off the engine and stepped into the chill. "Duke," she whispered as she opened the car door. Still no response. She leaned in, pressed her hand gently to his side. Warm, breathing. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Then, slowly, carefully, she slid her arms under his frail body. He didn't flinch, didn't resist. His head lolled softly against her shoulder like a forgotten coat. It wasn't the limpness of sleep, it was surrender. She unlocked the front door and carried him inside. The house welcomed them with its usual hush. Only the soft ticking of the kitchen clock echoed in the background. No voices, no footsteps, no Jake, just Sarah. And now Duke. She laid him down gently on a thick dog bed by the fireplace. Jake's old spot during cold evenings. Back when they used to dream out loud about adopting an old dog to keep them company in retirement. Old dogs don't need much, Jake once said with a smile. Just a warm blanket, a few ear scratches, and someone to sit beside. That dream had faded long ago. Now it returned in a different form, brittle, trembling, and barely hanging on. Sarah walked into the kitchen and warmed up some chicken broth. She soaked a small handful of soft kibble and stirred until it looked more like soup than food. Maybe, just maybe, Duke would take a bite. She placed the bowl in front of him. "Try a little, okay?" she whispered, nudging it gently closer to his nose. He didn't move. She sat down beside him and waited, watching his chest rise and fall with shallow effort. His gaze didn't flicker. His ears didn't twitch. It was as if her presence, her words, didn't exist. She waited 5 minutes. Then 10. Still nothing. She didn't cry. But a kind of cold spread slowly through her chest. Not from the temperature, but from the sharp ache of helplessness. It was like watching something alive, choosing not to be. That night, Sarah sat curled on the living room couch, wrapped in Jake's old blue throw. The fireplace glowed faintly, casting long shadows across the floor. Duke lay on his bed, exactly as she had left him, curled and unmoving. She didn't sleep. She listened to his breathing, irregular, shallow. Listened to the wind pressing against the window panes. Listened to the eerie stillness of a house that had forgotten how to be a home. Around 2 a.m., she drifted off briefly. A light doze. Then a sound, barely a noise. Not barking, not whimpering. A whine, so faint it could have been the wind. She sat up, heart pounding, and scanned the room. The bed was empty. In the pale light from the kitchen, she saw him, Duke, standing in the hallway, not collapsed, not pacing, just standing, still as a statue, staring at something. Sarah rose to her feet slowly, as though afraid she might shatter the moment. She followed his gaze and froze. At the end of the hallway, lit softly by moonlight to the window, hung a picture, Jake, sitting on the porch, smiling, holding a puppy in his arms. Sarah hadn't looked at that photo in a long time. Now, Duke stared at it, and then, from deep in his chest, came another sound, a low, broken whimper. Sarah's breath hitched. Duke hadn't made a sound since she met him, but now, facing a man he had never met, something deep inside him stirred. He whimpered again, longer this time, and her chest tightened as tears stung her eyes. How could he be reacting to Jake? Had he known someone like Jake? Was it instinct? Memory? Something sacred only dogs understand? She stepped closer, kneeling down beside him. "Duke," she said gently. He didn't turn his head, but his ears twitched. She placed her hand softly on his back. He didn't flinch. He didn't lean in either, but his breathing, though labored, remained steady. "Let's get you back to bed," she whispered. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he broke his gaze from the photograph and followed her. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a turning point. But it was something. The next morning, Sarah found Duke lying on his bed, facing the fireplace. Not asleep, just awake. Still, she placed a new bowl of warm broth in front of him. He didn't eat. But this time, when she sat beside him, he blinked. Not rapidly. Just once. Present. Aware. "Who were you?" she asked softly. "Before they gave up on you?" He said nothing. Of course. But something about the quiet way he watched her, not expecting anything, just watching, made her believe that beneath all the silence, a story still lived. A story not yet finished. That morning, Sarah knew one truth. A house can be walls and a roof. But home is where someone stays, even when there's nothing left to give. And Duke, he wasn't home yet. But maybe, just maybe, for the first time in months, he wasn't completely lost either. That morning, Sarah woke up earlier than usual. It wasn't because of an alarm or a noise. Something in the air, a subtle shift, had stirred her before the sun. The house felt no different, and yet something had changed. She walked barefoot into the kitchen, the wooden floor cool under her heels. Duke was curled on his bed by the fireplace, the same as every other morning, quiet, unmoving, eyes half closed. But something in the way he breathed made her pause. It was softer, less strained, still tired, but present. She didn't speak. She just stood there a moment, watching the old shepherd lying there like a ghost she couldn't quite reach. Then she turned, walked to the stove, and warmed up some broth. She added softened kibble, stirred it gently, and poured the mixture into a blue ceramic bowl. As steam curled into the morning air, she walked back, knelt down, and set the bowl in front of him. "Let's try again, buddy," she whispered. Duke didn't move. Not at first. Sarah sat cross-legged beside him, watching. The broth scent lingered between them like an unanswered question. 5 minutes passed, then 10, and then the smallest shift. His nose twitched. Just once. Sarah froze. Another slow breath, followed by a faint, wet sniff. Then Duke, still lying down, turned his head slightly toward the bowl. She didn't dare blink. He inched forward, labored, like each movement cost him. He leaned down and took one tentative sip. Not a gulp, not hunger, just curiosity, the beginning of wanting something again. Sarah felt her throat tighten. "You're eating," she whispered, barely able to believe the words. "You're really eating." She didn't cry, but her eyes stung, because that one sip felt louder than any bark, heavier than any word. It was a sign, a flicker. Something inside Duke had stirred, and it had said, "I'm not gone yet." The rest of the day unfolded slowly. Sarah didn't leave the house. She had no intention of missing a single moment. By midday, sunlight spilled onto the hardwood floor through the front windows. She stood near the kitchen counter, rinsing a mug. When she turned to leave the room, she didn't call Duke, didn't expect him to follow. But a soft sound made her stop. She turned around. There he was. Duke had stood up, shaky, unsure, but upright, and he was following her. His steps were small, awkward. His back legs trembled with each shift of weight. But he walked 3 steps, then paused. His breathing labored, but his eyes, they were watching her. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Sarah didn't speak. She didn't want to break the moment with words. She just knelt and placed her hand on the floor, allowing Duke to decide what came next. He didn't come closer, but he didn't walk away either. And for the first time since she brought him home, he chose movement. Not because he had to, but because something in him wanted to. That afternoon, Sarah sat on the floor beside the coffee table, sorting through old photographs. A wooden box lay open in front of her, the kind that held fragments of other lives. She pulled out one picture. Jake, sitting on the porch, smiling wide, a puppy tucked in his lap. A German Shepherd mix, small and floppy-eared. They had taken that photo during their first spring in Montana. Back then, they'd spoken often of getting a dog, maybe an older one, to give it a peaceful final chapter. That dream had faded when Jake got sick, but the photo remained, a reminder of a life that almost happened. "I think you would have liked him," she said aloud, holding the picture up. She didn't expect anything. But then from the rug nearby, she heard a shuffle. She turned. Duke had lifted his head. He was looking at her, not through her. At her. She blinked, stunned by the sudden awareness in his eyes. "You heard me," she said gently. Duke laid his head back down. But something about his gaze lingered in the room, like the echo of a long-lost conversation. Over the next few days, Sarah began to notice small shifts. Duke still slept most of the time. He still didn't bark or seek affection. But he followed her, room to room, never close, but never far behind. A quiet shadow that didn't need a touch to be felt. He no longer avoided her touch, though he rarely leaned into it. He ate slowly with coaxing, but he ate. At night, when the house grew quiet and Sarah sat alone by the fire, she would hear Duke sigh, a long, heavy exhale that sounded like something deep inside him was slowly laying down its armor. One evening, Sarah sat on the couch flipping through a photo album. She stopped at a picture of Jake holding up a pair of old police boots, laughing. She remembered that day, how they joked about Duke needing a badge if they ever got him. She looked over at Duke, now curled by the fireplace. "I think you were somebody," she whispered. He didn't move, but the air shifted. That night, when Sarah turned off the lights and climbed into bed, she didn't sleep right away. Instead, she stared up at the ceiling, listening. Soft steps. Not rushed, but deliberate. Duke walked down the hallway. He stopped just outside her bedroom door and lay down. Sarah didn't call him in, didn't move. She smiled into the dark. Sometimes a soul doesn't come back all at once. Sometimes it returns one breath at a time, one blink, one step, and when it does, the world, quiet as it is, begins to move again. In the mornings that followed, Sarah began to notice the way Duke sat. It wasn't the loose, lazy sprawl of most old dogs. It was rigid, deliberate, as if even in weakness, he had duties to perform. He would sit by the front door or near the window, facing outward, not to nap but to watch. The kind of posture that didn't come from comfort, but from discipline. She'd catch herself staring at him, wondering, who taught you that? What kind of life did you have before it all fell apart? Then, one rainy afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer she hadn't opened in years, Sarah found the intake paperwork from the shelter, a yellowed page tucked behind old bills. It had Duke's previous owner's name and address, scribbled in fading ink. She sat there for a long while, staring at the paper. There had always been something about Duke, something deeper than sadness, more structured than trauma. He didn't cower like an abused animal. He didn't flinch like one afraid. He watched. He measured. He waited. Sarah didn't want confrontation. She wanted answers. The house was nicer than she expected. 2 stories, a wraparound porch, trimmed hedges, luxury SUV in the driveway. The kind of place that didn't scream hardship or desperation. No signs of people who'd had to give up a dog because they couldn't afford to keep him. She rang the bell. A woman in her 60s opened the door, her expression cool. Lips painted precisely, pearls at her neck. "Hi, I'm Sarah Bennett," she began softly. "I adopted Duke, the dog you brought to Montana Haven shelter." The woman blinked, then gave a dismissive shrug. "Oh, him. Not Duke. Not our dog. Just him." Sarah's jaw tightened. "I was hoping to learn a little more about his past. There are things I can't explain. The way he acts, the way he watches. I think there's more to the story." The woman looked vaguely annoyed. "You'll have to speak to my husband. He handled most of that." She turned away without another word, calling into the house. "John, it's about Shadow." Sarah froze. Shadow? A moment later, a tall man in his 60s stepped into the doorway. Gray hair, weathered face, and eyes that looked like they'd once been sharper, like they'd seen things they no longer wished to remember. "So you've got him now?" he asked. "Yes," Sarah said. "His name is Duke now." He gave a faint nod. "Wasn't supposed to be ours forever." "What do you mean?" He rubbed his temples. "He wasn't a pet. Not originally. He was a working dog. 8K9. Sarah's breath caught. "A police dog?" she asked. He nodded. "Partner with me. Back then, his name was Shadow. And he wasn't just good. He was the best." The world tilted slightly. 1,000 things fell into place at once. The discipline, the silence, the way Duke observed without reacting, the way he had responded to Jake's picture that night, standing motionless in the hallway. All of it suddenly made sense. "He was trained," she murmured. "That's why he's so—" She didn't even finish the sentence. The man didn't need her to. "And yet," she said, her voice firmer now, "you left him." He looked down, jaw clenching. He wasn't himself anymore. He forgot commands. Got confused. His legs didn't work like they used to. He'd just stare at me, like he didn't remember who I was. Sarah stared at him. "And because of that you walked away?" He flinched. "I didn't want to watch him decline," he said. "Didn't want to see him as anything less than what he was. But he watched you his whole life, she said quietly, through everything. And when he needed you, really needed you, you disappeared. The man didn't respond. He didn't deny it. He just looked away. Sarah had heard enough. She turned to leave. "Wait," he called behind her. She stopped. "Is he still fighting?" he asked. His voice wasn't full of regret. It was full of something more complicated, something stuck between shame and longing. She turned back, eyes burning. "Yes," she said softly. "He is." And she walked away. As she pulled out of the driveway, something deeper hit her. Duke hadn't just been neglected. He had been abandoned by someone who should have known better, by a partner, a man who once trusted him with his life, and then discarded him when he became inconvenient. Duke wasn't just a dog who'd been left behind. He was a warrior without a mission, a protector no longer needed, a soldier forced into silence. She drove home with her knuckles white on the steering wheel. That night, when she walked through the door, Duke was lying near the fireplace, half dozing. As soon as he heard her footsteps, his ears twitched. Sarah knelt beside him and gently laid her hand along his back. For a moment, he leaned into her touch. "You weren't just a good dog," she whispered. "You were the best." Duke blinked slowly, and she added, voice thick with quiet promise, "And they didn't deserve you." He closed his eyes, not in pain, but in peace. That night, as the fire crackled low and the snow fell gently beyond the windows, Duke sighed and shifted his weight, just enough to rest his head against Sarah's knee. She sat perfectly still, and in that stillness, a broken bond began to mend, not through apology or explanation, but through something better, being seen, being known, and finally being safe. It started with silence, too much of it. Sarah woke that morning with a heaviness in her chest, the kind you can't explain, only feel. The house was quiet, but it was too quiet. No soft shuffle of paws on the floor. No weighty sigh from the fireplace. Just stillness. She threw off the blanket and rushed out of bed. Duke lay curled in his usual spot, but something was wrong. His body was shaking. Not the gentle twitch of a dream, but a violent, unsteady tremble that made the bed beneath him vibrate. His limbs jerked involuntarily. His chest rose in frantic bursts, and his eyes, half open, were glassy, unfocused. "Duke!" she gasped, falling to her knees beside him. Her hand touched his side, burning hot, too hot. He didn't react. Panic surged through her body. She wrapped him in a blanket and rushed him to the car, barely remembering to grab her keys. The drive to the veterinary clinic was a blur of red lights, whispered prayers, and trembling fingers gripping the steering wheel. "Please, please stay." The vet clinic lights were already on when she burst through the door. "He's not breathing right," she called. "He's burning up. His body won't stop shaking. Please, please help." A nurse rushed over. Dr. Whitaker appeared moments later and gently lifted Duke from her arms. She followed him into the back until the door closed, leaving her on the other side, breathless and shaking. Then came the waiting. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. She stared at the floor, the walls, the sterile clock ticking above the counter. Every second felt too long. Finally, Dr. Whitaker returned. "He's stable," he said softly. Sarah nearly collapsed with relief. But then she saw his expression. "But it's serious," he continued. "Sarah, he's 19. His organs are failing. It's a miracle he's made it this far." She sat down slowly. She knew this. Of course she did. But hearing it, out loud, from someone who had always spoken in careful hope, felt like a punch to the chest. "There's more," he said gently. "I need to ask something difficult." Her throat tightened. "Do you want to let him go?" The room spun. "Let him go? Just like that? After all this time? After every breath, every step, every tiny miracle?" Sarah looked toward the exam room, even though she couldn't see inside. Her hands trembled. Duke had just started to come back, just started to live again. And now she had to decide whether to end it. Her heart screamed no. Her head whispered be kind. Her grief tried to speak, but it couldn't find the words. She tried, but her voice cracked. She closed her eyes and saw him lying there, week after week, slowly returning to her. Each moment had been earned, fought for. But what had his life really been? Service, obedience, loyalty, pain, and then abandonment. Had he ever been allowed to rest? Had anyone ever told him it was okay to stop? Sarah pressed her fist to her chest, holding herself together. If he's suffering, she said hoarsely, if this is just pain for him. She didn't finish the sentence. Dr. Whitaker sat beside her. There's a third option, he said quietly. Sarah looked up. We can try intensive care, he explained. Stronger medication. For support. Pain management. But it won't be easy. It'll take everything you've got. And there are no promises. He paused. But I don't think he's ready to give up yet. Those words, I don't think he's ready, echoed inside her like a lifeline. She felt it too, in her bones. Duke wasn't done. Neither was she. Sarah stood. Then we fight, she said. Dr. Whitaker nodded. Let's get to work. The next 2 weeks became a blur of alarms, medication charts, hand-fed meals, and sleepless nights. Sarah set reminders to check Duke's temperature every 4 hours. She crushed pills, mixed them with chicken broth, spooned them into his mouth with gentle patience. She cleaned accidents, changed blankets, massaged his legs when the cramps came. And every night, she knelt beside him and whispered, "One more day, okay? Just one more." Some nights, she cried on the kitchen floor. Other nights, she simply watched him breathe, terrified each breath would be his last. But then little things. One morning, he licked the broth from the spoon without coaxing. Another day, he shifted positions on his own. Then, one quiet evening, while Sarah was rubbing his legs, he nudged her hand with his nose. She froze. "Hey there," she whispered, blinking through tears. He licked her fingers. Once. Soft. Certain. It wasn't much, but it was everything. The following week, Sarah opened the front door to step out for a breath of fresh air. She turned to look back, expecting Duke to be sleeping near the fireplace. But he wasn't there. He was standing. His legs wobbled. His paws trembled. But he stood, and then, with agonizing slowness, he took a step. Then another. Sarah clapped her hand to her mouth, eyes wide. "You're walking," she breathed. "You did it." Duke stopped after 4 steps. His sides heaved with effort. His head hung low. But when he looked up at her, his eyes were clear. Not young, not strong, but alive. Days became weeks. Duke grew stronger, not by leaps and bounds, but through steady progress. He would never run again, but he could walk to the porch, sniff the breeze, lie in the sun. One afternoon, Sarah sat beside him, running her fingers through his fur as they watched the shadows stretch across the yard. "You weren't supposed to still be here," she said softly. "But you are." Duke looked at her. Quiet, calm, present. "You're not Shadow anymore," she whispered. "You're Duke, and you're home." He let out a long, contented breath and laid his head in her lap. For the first time in a very long time, he wasn't waiting to die. He was choosing to live. In the days that followed, time in Sarah's house seemed to move in quiet, careful increments. The tick of a spoon stirring broth, the soft rustle of a blanket being laid over thin fur, the fragile rise and fall of Duke's chest as he slept through another long night. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just tiny markers of survival, of hope. Each morning began the same way. Sarah knelt beside him with his medicine and food. Each night, she checked his breathing, rubbed his legs, whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "We're still here. One more day. I've got you." Not every day brought improvement. Some mornings, Duke refused to eat. Some nights, he groaned in his sleep. But Sarah stayed, holding the line when he couldn't. Until one afternoon, everything changed with a single, quiet moment. She was sitting beside him on the floor, gently massaging his stiff legs like she had 100 times before. The fire flickered low behind them. Her hands moved in slow, practiced circles, careful not to press too hard. And then she felt it. Something nudged her hand. She paused, unsure. Again, a soft pressure, damp and warm. She looked down. Duke was pressing his nose against her palm. Not accidentally, not out of instinct. Deliberately. Sarah froze, her eyes welling instantly. She didn't move, barely breathed. And then, slowly, Duke lifted his head and licked her hand. Once, softly, gently, as if to say, I see you, as if to say, I'm still here. It was nothing to someone else. But to Sarah, it was a miracle. Not a movie scene, not a heroic recovery. Just a small, undeniable act of connection, of choice. Life, returning, not with a roar but a whisper. That evening, Sarah wrapped herself in a blanket and sat on the couch, watching the fire glow against the old wooden floor. Duke lay nearby, no longer curled in a ball, but stretched out just slightly, a sign of comfort, of safety. Something in the air had shifted. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living. Each day afterward brought new signs. Subtle but steady, Duke began following her from room to room. Never right beside her, just close enough. When she moved from the kitchen to the den, he shuffled behind. When she stepped out onto the porch, he appeared moments later, sitting at the threshold like a quiet sentinel. He didn't ask for affection, but he no longer recoiled from it. He didn't wag his tail, but his ears perked when she spoke. Sarah started noticing the sighs. Late at night, when the world was silent and the fire had gone to embers, Duke would let out a long, slow exhale. Not of pain, but of release. Like he was finally setting down the weight of a life he'd carried for too long. One cold morning, Sarah opened the front door to let in fresh air. Frost glistened on the grass. She didn't expect Duke to move. But when she turned around, he wasn't in his bed. He was standing in the hallway. On his own. No support. His legs shook slightly. His breath was uneven. But he stood. Then one step. Another. By the time he reached her, Sarah was already covering her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with shock and awe. "You're walking," she whispered. "You're really walking." He stopped after a few feet, then looked up at her. And in that gaze, she saw something that made her knees weak, a flicker of pride. From then on, each day held a small miracle. Duke began venturing onto the porch in the afternoons, lie on the mat in the sun. Sarah brought out a blanket and sat beside him with tea. He would sniff the breeze, ears twitching at far-off birdsong. Sometimes he would rest his head on her foot. Sometimes he would simply be near. And that was enough. One evening, as she sorted through old boxes, Sarah found a photo of Jake holding a German shepherd puppy. It had been taken during their first spring in Montana, back when they still made plans out loud. She sat on the rug, photo in hand, and called softly, "Hey, Duke, I think you would have liked him." Duke lifted his head. Sarah stared. He had heard her. He had understood. She smiled, blinking away sudden tears. "You remember things," she said. "You still do, don't you?" Duke didn't answer, of course. But he laid his head back down slowly, and this time he let it rest against the edge of her knee. At night, Sarah left her bedroom door open. She no longer wondered if he'd come. He did. Quietly. Always. He would lie just outside the doorway, close enough to see her, far enough to be his own. That was Duke. Not demanding, just present. One night, when she reached out a hand from under the blanket, Duke stood and stepped into the room, not just to lie nearby, but to stay. He laid his head on her slipper, breathed a slow, warm breath, and closed his eyes. Sarah didn't move. She simply whispered, "You're not lost anymore." Life didn't return to Duke in one grand act. It returned slowly, through warmth, touch, breath, and time, through showing up, through staying, through refusing to let go. And sometimes that's all it takes. Not a cure, not a rescue, just a touch, and someone willing to wait for it to matter. March came slowly to Montana. The snow didn't melt all at once. It receded in patches, leaving behind slick stone paths and muddy soil. Pine branches began to tremble with buds, and birdsong returned in cautious bursts. The sky stayed gray most mornings, but the air had changed. There was softness in it now, something like mercy. Sarah sat on the porch with a mug of tea, wrapped in an old quilt Jake once used. Her gaze drifted across the yard, where Duke, frail but standing, moved with careful, deliberate steps. He sniffed the ground around the base of a tree, then paused to look toward the fields beyond the fence. Every step still wobbled, but they were his. He wasn't wandering aimlessly. He was surveying, choosing, living. A few weeks ago, she had been counting his breaths, bracing for the moment they stopped. Now she was watching him claim the space around him, not as a visitor, not as a burden, but as if he belonged, because he did. Sarah smiled softly, not calling his name, not interrupting, just watching. "You'd love this," she murmured to the wind, thinking of Jake. "You always said old souls deserve a place to rest, not be forgotten." She looked back at Duke, who had just turned toward the porch. He saw her, and instead of lying down where he stood, he walked, slow but steady, toward her. That evening, after dinner, Sarah lit the fireplace and settled onto the couch. She laid out Duke's blanket and cushion beside the hearth like always. But Duke wasn't there. She found him instead sitting by the open front door, his body outlined by the faint moonlight pouring onto the wooden floor. She joined him without speaking. The night was cool and still, the only sound the rustle of distant branches. For a long while neither of them moved. Then Sarah said gently, "They used to call you Shadow, but that name, it belonged to who they needed you to be." She reached out, fingers brushing the fur behind his ear. "But you don't have to be anyone's shadow anymore. You're not a soldier now, not a tool. You're not waiting for orders." Duke turned his head, slowly, looking at her. There was no urgency in his eyes, no fear, no confusion, only presence. "Your name is Duke," she whispered, "and this time it's yours." That night, for the first time, Duke didn't sleep by the door. He walked into her bedroom, uninvited, unprompted, and laid down near the foot of the bed, not because he was guarding it, not because he was trained to, because he wanted to be close. Sarah didn't say a word. She simply reached down, touched his back, and let her hand rest there. She slept deeper than she had in 2 years. The next morning, while sorting old boxes in the hall closet, Sarah found something unexpected. Tucked inside a shoebox was one of Jake's old gloves, leather worn, used during his volunteer shifts at the shelter. She hadn't touched it in years. That evening, she left it on the floor near Duke's cushion without much thought. The next day, she found a glove in the kitchen, not chewed, not torn, just moved and placed carefully beside her chair. She stared at it for a long moment, then at Duke. He was watching her. "I see," she said quietly. "You remember?" He blinked slowly. It wasn't just memory. It was recognition. Of a scent, of a person, of a life. From that day on, the glove stayed in the living room, sometimes near Duke's bed, sometimes at the foot of the stairs, always somewhere he could find it. It became a quiet ritual between them, a conversation without words. One afternoon, as a breeze blew into the open windows, Sarah and Duke sat side by side on the porch. The wind ruffled the old fur along his spine. His ears twitched at the sound of birds overhead. "You know," she said, breaking the silence, "you never tried to fill Jake's place, and I never tried to fill what you lost either." She reached over, resting her palm against his shoulder. "But somehow we made space for each other anyway." Duke didn't move. He just sighed, a long, full-body breath, and laid his head in her lap. Sarah let her hand settle gently on his head. "You're not who they said you were," she whispered. "You never were." She smiled through the quiet. "You're Duke, and you're home." He didn't wag his tail. He didn't bark. But in that moment, warmth on his fur, her hand in his, the world fading into soft light, he didn't need to. Everything that needed saying had already been said. No one knew how much time Duke had left. Sarah didn't ask. She didn't count anymore, because time was no longer measured in days or diagnoses. It was measured in quiet mornings, in gentle glances, in moments shared between two souls who had both been broken and slowly mended each other. Duke had been abandoned, forgotten, but he had not died nameless. He had not died unloved. He had not died alone. My name is no longer Shadow. I am Duke, and I am home. Duke's journey wasn't one of loud triumphs or miraculous recoveries. It was built on quiet choices, a sip of broth, a trembling step, a soft breath shared between two souls who had both been abandoned by the world. And yet, together they found home. If this story touched you, let it linger. Let it remind you that healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sighs. Sometimes it comes back in a single touch or a name whispered in the dark. There are so many Dukes out there, forgotten warriors, gentle hearts in fading bodies. And maybe, just maybe, they're waiting for someone like you to see them again. If this message resonates with you, please leave a comment, share this story, and subscribe to Hero Paws 77. Every subscription brings us closer to our goal of 10,000 compassionate voices and gives us the strength to keep creating heartfelt, meaningful stories like this one. Because when we tell stories that matter, we don't just rescue dogs. We rescue parts of ourselves. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. And above all, thank you for believing that love, even at the end of all things, still matters.